Corey Erdman and Morgan Campbell here in the Fight Network studios, and we're going to get a little political here because we have obviously a historical, groundbreaking political decision. Nothing confirmed quite yet, but a political decision that could have major implications on the boxing world. Of course, we're talking about the fact that discussions have opened up between the US and Cuba once again. And I guess the first question, Morgan, is how quickly could this possibly result in us seeing more Cuban fighters in professional boxing and in the United States?
Well, first of all, the normalization of relations between the U.S. And Cuba is a little bit like Pacquiao-Mayweather. It's the thing that makes sense for everyone. It's the thing that everyone wants, that a lot of people on both sides want, but if they can't agree on it, then it's not going to happen quickly, if at all. Because what people forget, because Barack Obama made this decision, or made this announcement saying, I plan to normalize relations between the United States and Cuba. But this decision still has to get through Congress, and Congress is full of Republicans, some of whom are going to be very, very, very hostile to the idea of normalizing relations with Cuba, but others are other Republicans, Senate Republicans, House Republicans are very pro-business, and there are a lot of business interests in the United States that have had their eye on Cuba for a long time. Point is, they've made this announcement. Doesn't mean any of this is happening tomorrow, if at all. That's the first thing. That's just on the scheduling of it.
Yeah.
But even if this happens tomorrow, it gets through Congress in a week from now, a month from now, by June. The other thing that has to happen is Cuba has to lift its ban on pro sports. Pro sports have been banned in Cuba since 1961. Normalizing relations doesn't necessarily mean that the Cuban government is going to turn around and make pro sports legal again. So if they normalize relations between the United States and Cuba without reinstituting pro sports on the island, then you're still in a position where Cuban fighters have to leave Cuba before they can turn pro. And that's either way, that's not a simple thing to do.
No, but that's something that they would probably do anyway. You know, even if you go back to the last era of Cuban fighters that we saw on American television, the last era of professional Cuban fighters who did it legally, they went and relocated to the United States anyway. Right. And it is interesting that people talk about the Cuban fighters as not being draws necessarily, but if you look at that golden era of boxing television, you think about the guys who were on TV all the time. It was Kid Gavilan, Florentino Fernandez, Isaac Logart, Benny Paret. I mean, these were television superstars, and Fidel Castro was in support of this.
Right.
And then 2 years later, everything gets wiped out. So even though it's 60 years ago, there is a precedent that these guys can do well and thrive in America and potentially become draws if everything went swimmingly.
Well, what people forget, or what people need to keep in mind, is that boxing, like baseball, is a hugely popular sport on that island. And again, having had this conversation with Rigondeaux's manager, Gary Hyde, who manages a number of Cubans, he's really eager for pro sports to return to the island because he wants to stage a card there. And he told me, well, obviously we wouldn't charge $2,000 for ringside seats, but scale the ticket price to something that's affordable to Cubans, and you'll get big crowds because, again, that island loves boxing the way it loves baseball. So, and the point that I was making as well was that, a lot of the rap against Cuban fighters in the United States is that they don't have a big audience. They can come to the United States, be based in Miami. Even fans in Miami don't really turn out to see them. But the point I was making is that if you brought them to Cuba, they still have all kinds of fans in Cuba. If you brought them to Cuba and let them fight, they'd be a big draw at the gate. But I think the difference between Cuba and, let's say, China, which is still technically a communist country, but participates fully in the global sports economy, is that China has 1.6 billion people. Cuba still has about 11 million. So companies like Top Rank, they'll go sign Zhu Ximing, they'll stage pay-per-views in Macau, in China, because they see China as this huge market. You can't charge $70 for a pay-per-view the way you can in the United States, but they're looking at scale, and they can charge $2 per pay-per-view, $5 for a pay-per-view, but sell, a potential audience, sell to a potential audience of 200 million people. Cuba offers the same low price, the same kind of lack of purchasing power, but without the scale that China has. So they're not quite equals in that regard, and that's kind of the challenge that Cuban fighters, people who want to promote Cuban fighters are going to face.
However, you could have a situation where if travel were allowed, you could have people who could come across the border and watch fights there. I mean, that is possible. It's something that used to happen as well. I mean, there's so many, but nothing has happened.
Well, again, all of this, we've been talking about this like it's a done deal, but it has to get through Congress. A lot of Republicans in Congress who are ready to oppose anything Barack Obama does. But again, what's going to happen in Congress is that the anti-Castro Republicans might butt heads with the pro-business Republicans who, again, Caterpillar, the manufacturer, is eager to do business in Cuba. There's a lot of Republicans who represent agricultural districts who already sell some food to Cuba, who are eager to sell more food in Cuba. So those interests might collide. But again, none of this is happening quickly.
Well, it's a story that we will continue to cover, obviously, as it unfolds, and it could take many years. But as boxing fans, we certainly look forward to seeing more Cuban talent in the United States in the near future.